everybody, Jane here, and today I am talking about A Secret Sisterhood. And I don't really feel that there can be spoilers for this book, but just in case, let's say that this is a spoiler review. I am going to be reviewing it, but I'm also just going to be talking about the contents and why I think it's important for writers. A Secret Sisterhood is about the friendships of some of the famous writers of time. It covers one of Jane Austen's dear friends who was a governess and never really came to fame herself. Charlotte Bronte. We always generally think of her as just being close to her sisters and her brother, but she had friendships outside of that as well. And her, some of her good friends actually became writers in their own right as well. Then you had George Eliot, who was really good friends with Harry Beecher Stowe, and you also had Virginia Woolf. And Virginia had kind of a love-hate relationship with her really good friend that they mention in the book, whose name was Catherine Mansfield. So, the reason I actually picked up this book in the first place was because I had always been interested in the friendship between C.S. Lewis and Tolkien and how much they influenced each other's work. And I haven't really had a lot of that in my own life as a writer. When I was growing up, I did have a best friend who was a writer, and she was actually a much better writer than I was at the time. Her mother was a writer and had several published books, and she and I both wrote like fan fiction, and I loved her work, and it was amazing. But then ultimately our friendship ended sort of over a boy. We didn't like the same boy, but she liked a boy, and I told the boy that she liked him, and she didn't want him to know that she liked him. And again, this was, high school, junior high, so it was just, one of those stupid disasters that ended a really good friendship by two writers, and we never were able to reconcile after that. But it was interesting to me to see how these women had their ups and downs, and how they connected, and how professionally they may have looked at things very different, looked at life very different, and how there were some jealousies and some competitions with their friends, but they had huge impacts on each other's lives. And I do think that every writer needs at least like one really good writer friend, not just to bounce ideas off of, but also to help inspire them and to tell them when they've taken a wrong path, and to celebrate their victories, because only other writers can really understand writer victories. It's just not something that somebody who's not in our world can fully comprehend. So ratings wise of this book, I would give it, if you're a writer and a female, I would give it a 4 out of 5 stars. You really should read this book. Absolutely. If you are a woman and a writer, pick it up, read it. It's amazing. If you're not a writer, I'm not sure how much you'll relate to the characters in the book. It's an interesting read, and it's very interesting to see the historic writers and kind of know more about their lives. That was really cool to me, is learning about people's lives. I had never heard of George Eliot before, and I didn't know much about Virginia Woolf, and I learned so much about them. George Eliot, the thing that stood out most was she really was very against the grain. She was living with a man without marriage before that was okay to do, and it affected how she was seen by society and others. And even though she was a famous writer, it did kind of limit her social life. And Harriet Beecher Stowe, who was her friend, was super religious, and they had some clashes, I would say, about things like that. Harriet Beecher Stowe was really interested in like the seeing spirits and seances and stuff, and I think that kind of creeped Marion out a little bit from what the book said. Marion was George Eliot's real name, and it didn't sit right with her. It didn't really work for her. Another thing I found really interesting with these books, or this book, and others that I read about the time period, was so many of these women were considered unattractive. And that was one of the things that kind of bonded some of them, is I'm not beautiful. And so in our world where marriage is what you do, what kind of life can I possibly have? And I think that is really personal to me because, I've never been a pretty girl. And I remember being younger, and my grandmother actually told me I would never marry because I'm just not pretty enough. And my dad would tell me, well, I better learn how to be good at cooking and cleaning because, I didn't have the looks to attract a man, so better attract him with my domestic skills. I'm here to tell you I can neither cook nor clean particularly well, but I'm a writer and I don't care that much. And there were other women in history that I learned about who had the similar issue of they did great things because they were not particularly attractive, and that was the case particularly with Charlotte Bronte. Her friend Mary had commented on the fact that she wasn't very pretty, and I think that probably hurt her feelings a little bit. But George Eliot and Harriet Beecher Stowe both were not very attractive women, and because of that, they were given an education and given a lot of things that they probably wouldn't have been had they been born beauties. So I think the world can be grateful that they maybe didn't win in the genetics lottery. But this book was a good read. It was at times a little bit long and tedious. It could be a little long-winded at times. That is one thing I don't necessarily like about nonfiction. I love nonfiction when it gets to the point, but there were times it dragged, and this book took me over a month to read because it just wasn't a page-turner for me. I wanted to get through it, and I was interested in the stories, and because of it, I did go get biographies of Harriet Beecher Stowe and George Eliot and Virginia Woolf because I didn't know very much about them, and the book made them very interesting. So I was excited to read about them, but it definitely wasn't a page-turner, and it definitely was a little bit of a slow read. But as I said, if you are a writer, and especially if you're a woman writer, absolutely worth it. One thing it said in the beginning that I thought was really, really profound was that back in the day, it was really hard for a woman writer and a man writer to be friends because women were kind of supposed to just be like, oh, you're a wonderful writer to their man writer friend, and weren't really supposed to be like competing with him to be good. My brother is also a writer, and I don't think we're competitive, but he doesn't need me to inflate his ego, and so I think that's a good thing. I don't think we're competitive, but I also, he is not hurt by the fact that my successes are my successes and his successes are his successes, so we don't worry too much about that. But back in the day, it would have been a big deal. You would have been very rude if you were a woman and were like, well, I'm a writer too, and I'm proud of my accomplishments, especially if your partner or your brother, whoever, wasn't where you were in the writing world. Another thing I thought was interesting was, just how hard it was to have literary friendships, because there weren't a ton of female writers. A lot of women weren't educated, and the ones that were, writing just wasn't what they did. They might be painters, and they might do domestic art, sewing, things like that, but I think writing was still kind of something that was a little taboo, and especially when you get to the darker writing, like the Bronte writing, I think it crossed some lines in their society. Certainly today, as a romance writer, it's one of the challenges I face, because I love writing, but my writing has some steam to it, and so, there are a lot of women who don't appreciate that, or who are a little bit turned off by writing that has that kind of content. So, and you know, romance is very much a women's genre. I can't imagine if I was writing something like pirate adventures or something that was more of a masculine genre, how difficult that would be. But anyway, this book, Secret Sisterhood, written by Emily Mindukawa and Emma Claire Sweeney. If you're a writer, especially if you're a woman writer, check it out. Alright, thank you for watching, and click the button below to subscribe for more videos in the future. Alright, bye.